the Crown Heights riots were not a great moment for journalism. Journalism failed. And it failed because it had instincts that didn't prove true in this case. So one of the principles of journalism is tell both sides. Tell what the blacks say, tell what the Hasidim say. That would be a very balanced way to tell what was happening in Crown Heights. And in 1991, there were riots in Crown Heights, and it began when a motorcade of the Rebbe, of Rabbi Schneerson, returning from the cemetery of his father-in-law to visit the grave. There was a motorcade, several cars. The last car, the last car in the motorcade rushed to make a light, went out of control, went up on the sidewalk and killed a 7-year-old African-American boy, Caribbean-American boy. And before the ambulance was able to arrive, a crowd gathered and chanting started, and the Hasidic Jews who were in the car were being threatened and being taunted by a mob that had gathered that night. And throughout that night and the next 4 days, there were riots in Crown Heights. Now, on the first night, as I mentioned, this Caribbean-American boy, who was 7 years old, Gavin Cato, as I recall, was killed. And later that night, a Hasidic student named Yankel Rosenbaum was surrounded by a mob and stabbed to death. Well, he was stabbed and then later died in the hospital. And it seemed like your perfect he said, she said story. There's one side, there's another side, one dead on the Hasidic side, one dead on the African-American side. And these two communities are at each other's throats. They're fighting. And for the first few days of the riot, the way that the press covered it was there are bad guys here and bad guys there, and they're clashing. Because that's what you try to do. You try to show how there's logic on both sides. But I was on the streets, and I'm Jewish. There were also several reporters with me who are not Jewish, and several reporters who were African American who covered more of the other side of the story. I was mostly at the Chabad headquarters, and I saw what was going on. I didn't see bad guys on both sides. I saw Jews as victims. And now other reporters may have seen other things, but over those 4 days, Jews were attacked, Jewish homes had their windows broken, Jewish stores were looted, and it didn't happen the other way. There was even a picture in the New York Times one day of a group of kids looting a Jewish store, and then there was a picture of a Hasidic man with an umbrella waving off his attackers, as if to say, you know, he's a bad guy and they're bad guys. But it wasn't a two-sided fight. It was an attack on Jews. And it took several days before the press was able to acknowledge that, report that, and come to that judgment. The first few days, the reporting was quite bad. And I was on the street. I was phoning in. That's how we used to do it in those days. We didn't have laptops with us. I would phone in from a phone booth on the corner what was happening to my editors. And one of the writers was getting information from the other side, and I was giving information. And remember the headline the first day was Jews and blacks riot on the streets of Crown Heights. And that's not what was going on. And I called my editor. I said, we're getting this story wrong. And but that was the narrative that went on for several days. Eventually, people started to call out what was really going on, and it was an editor of mine, a great man named Abe Rosenthal, who first said that, no, what's going on in Crown Heights is a pogrom. It's not a riot of two sides. It's an attack on Jews. And we've seen things like this before. And later on, there was a state investigation that pretty much confirmed that. So while journalism aspires for the truth, sometimes it works too hard to bend over to say, well, you're okay, I'll listen to you, I'll listen to you. No, sometimes there is truth on one side and not on the other side. Deborah Lipstadt spoke, and she has been, she's a historian of the dark period of our history, of the Shoah. And she explained again and again why she will not debate Holocaust deniers. You can't take a historian and put them against a liar. And in some ways, that's what was going on in Crown Heights. There was one side was the victim, and you can say that the perpetrators are victims also. Those stories were written by a team. Now, today, if you pick up the New York Times, it'll say, usually there are two bylines, one or two bylines, and then at the bottom it'll say, reporting also by 6 other people. In those days, there was one byline on the story, and that went to the writer. I remember his name was John Kiffner, and he was a rewrite man. He wasn't even in Crown Heights. He got reports from the police, he got reports from politicians, he got reports from his reporters on the ground. So my contribution to the story was under John Kiffner's name. And it was that way for several days until the end, after the riots calmed down. I did stories on my own with my byline. And they more reflected the story of Jew as victim. Now, sometimes it's hard for Ari Goldman to say, oh yeah, the Jews are right, because maybe I was working with an African-American reporter, she would say, no, the Jews are the perpetrators. But sometimes it's not just loyalty that brings us to our conclusion. Sometimes it's just the truth. And here, I saw Jews being attacked. I never saw an African-American being attacked. And the story needed to be told the right way. It was not at first, but eventually the press corrected itself. And this is something that I deal with all the time. People come to me and they say, the New York Times is anti-Semitic, or it's anti-Israel, or it's, it had this terrible story. Sometimes we get it wrong, and sometimes we do a story that's what we know at the time, or our earliest conclusion, and then other facts come out later. You can't always take back what you've done, but there's a great line about journalism is the first draft of history. And we can only tell you what we know today. And sometimes what we know today is flawed. Sometimes it's not, doesn't have all of the answers. So it's an imperfect process, but it comes pretty close to getting its goal of the truth.